Hello, I'm Nate, aka B-Tier Mutineer, and in today's video, part of my B-Tier guides, I'm going to take you through an in-depth guide to party compositions in Dragon Age Origins. A viewer actually suggested this video, and I thought it was a great idea to have a separate guide talking about this, because while I do mention party composition in my builds for the Warden and the Companions, I don't go into a lot of detail there since the guide is obviously focused on the character build itself. The way I'll split this guide up is by talking first about my general advice, and then offer party composition examples that are centered around your Warden's possible builds. I obviously can't talk about every single Warden build out there, but this guide is more about taking you through hypothetical scenarios so that you better understand the ideas behind my recommendations. That way, you'll be able to feel more confident in choosing your party composition in your playthroughs, even if you end up going with a suboptimal group. Before we get into it, I want to say a special thank you to my members who help keep this channel running. I'd really appreciate it if you'd consider joining the channel as a member to support me and unlock perks like early access to videos. Joining is very much appreciated, but not required. I am always thankful, even if you just take the time to like the video and maybe leave a comment. First off, I have 3 recommendations that I consider to be the essentials everyone should know before choosing their party. 1. Always have a proper tank. 2. Have a mix of melee and ranged characters, and 3. Mages make the game easier. When I say have a proper tank, I'm referring to having an actual warrior in the party who can use the threaten and taunt abilities to draw enemies away from your other allies, and also have enough defensive stats like good armor, defenses, and health to be able to take more hits than most other party members. You can absolutely have multiple tanky characters, aka characters with good defenses, but unfortunately, unless they have access to threaten and taunt, they won't be able to act as full tanks since they can't draw away enemy aggression. You do have a lot of freedom in terms of your tank's build though. You could use a weapon and shield tank like Alistair, which tends to be the more classic choice. However, two-handed tanks are just as good, if not even better, due to having the Indomitable sustained, which makes them immune to not only knockdown, but also stun and slip effects. And of course, you can also use Shale as a tank since she has access to the warrior talents in addition to her special golem abilities. I haven't tried to play the game with a dual wielder tank yet, since it seems a bit underpowered due to not having a defensive ability like Shield Wall or Indomitable, but you could probably also make a dual wielder tank work if you have a mage in the party who can dispel harmful effects or heal and buff them. I also recommend putting 1 or 2 strong hail runes into their weapons or find other gear with bonuses to physical resistance to try to make them more resistant to knockdowns and other physical effects. The main reason why I recommend having a mix of melee and ranged characters in your party is because you're pretty much always going to fight a mix of melee and ranged enemies, and it would be quite ineffective to have a melee only or ranged only party. If you're fighting archers and only have melee characters, the enemy archers will freely shoot your party while your characters can't do anything else other than run towards them. If you're fighting strong melee enemies and only have ranged characters, unless you manage to kill or disable the enemies before they reach you, it can be pretty scary to be face to face with something like an ogre or revenant, as ranged characters generally tend to be quite squishy, so you won't be able to take too many hits or, God forbid, special abilities from these kinds of enemies. The other important reason why a mixed ranged party is needed is the reason I always mention in my build guides, which is that if you have 3 or 4 melee characters in your active party, and you're fighting in an interior level with small corridors or rooms, it's very likely that your melee characters will get stuck trying to position themselves around the enemies in order to attack them. And while your characters are stuck, the enemies will be attacking whoever is or isn't in position. Those kinds of situations are really frustrating since it isn't really your fault. The game's pathfinding is a bit weird, there's also only so much space in these types of areas, and sometimes I feel like the designers didn't consider these factors when they added such a large group of enemies to fight in these tight spaces. So I generally recommend having 2 melee and 2 ranged characters, or 1 melee tank and 3 ranged characters. You could probably make do with 3 melee and 1 ranged, but you may need to manually position your melee characters every once in a while if they get stuck. The final thing about mages making the game easier isn't so much a recommendation or rule that you always have to have a mage, but instead treat this as a warning. It's more that not using a mage will make the game much more challenging, whereas having a mage in your party seems to be something the game is balanced around. Skilled or experienced players will be able to finish the game without ever using a mage quite easily, but if you're a newer player, you're kind of shooting yourself in the foot if you aren't using at least one mage, especially with heal and a few other spells that CC enemies such as Winter's Grasp, Cone of Cold, Paralyze, and so on. Healing spells are great to have on top of the consumable health poultices each character can use, because you can heal a character even if they're being CC'd in some way and can't use a poultice. And of course, being able to CC, aka disable enemies, is very powerful, especially for high priority targets like enemy spellcasters. Mages also have various ways to counteract or at least protect your allies from dangerous enemy spells or abilities. If an enemy casts Curse of Mortality or an ogre or dragon grabs your ally, you can cast Force Field on them to make them immune to damage and keep them alive through something they may not have otherwise been able to survive. Mages also have access to a lot of Area of Effect, AoE damaging spells, so you can very quickly get rid of a bunch of weaker enemies by using a Fireball, for example. So in terms of mages, no, it's not absolutely necessary to have a mage in your party, but if tougher enemy encounters are destroying your non-magic party, before you struggle through more of the same throughout the entire game, remember that you can likely fix your party feeling so weak by adding a mage in there. It's possible you're getting beaten for other reasons as well, such as putting too many points in weak attributes like willpower or constitution, not having a proper tank to be a damage sponge and draw enemy aggression, or even not having good enough gear. But I'd start with adding the mage first and see how you're doing after that. If you're still struggling even with a mage, maybe you're in an area that's too high level for you, or else have a poor build for too many of your characters. To fix your builds, you can watch some of my other guides, like the Guide to Combat Mechanics that explains how every stat in combat works, if you want to understand the mechanics and make your own builds, or my many different character builds for your Warden or companions if you prefer something pre-built. So these have been the three main things to keep in mind when you think about how to build your party in DAO. We'll get into specific compositions now based on your Warden's class and build, but it's really up to your personal preference. Some compositions may be officially better on paper, but may not suit your playstyle, so I always recommend trying things out and choosing the party that best fits your preferences. Before I get into the detailed examples and explanations of parties for each Warden class and build archetype, I want to warn you ahead of time that I generally don't recommend using Zevran or Ogren in your party. Even though I will list Zevran as an option for a dual-wielding damager or Ogren for a two-handed damager, they're not my first picks. I'll explain why. The main reason is that in the base game, neither of them are built well and will likely cause you trouble, especially if you recruit them at a later level. If you have the follower autoscaling tweak from the Dane's Fixes mod, the game will stop auto-leveling them from level 7 onwards, so you'll have more freedom to build them however you like, and they won't have attribute points spread out everywhere. Ogren would be fixed if you have this tweak, though you are likely to recruit him quite late since Orzammar and the Deep Roads are high-level areas. If you want to use Ogren after that, of course feel free to do so if you use this mod tweak, or respecialize him entirely with another mod. However, even with this tweak, Zevran as a dual wielder is not a character I recommend unless you really like him, because dual wielding rogues rely on backstabs. Unfortunately, the game's AI isn't very good, even if you're using a mod like Advanced Tactics, so your rogue companions don't really get into backstab positions on their own very well. You'd have to either micromanage Zevran and manually position him behind an enemy, or else unlock the coup de grace talent ASAP, get paralyze runes in Zevran's daggers, and ideally also have stunning or paralyzing abilities in your party so that Zevran can backstab the enemies you disable without the need to be in a particular position. Finally, another thing to mention as somewhat connected to this problem is that it's possible for you to simply dislike the starting build a particular companion has when you recruit them. And in that case, even if you like the character's personality or lore, you might avoid using them in your party because you don't enjoy their gameplay or think that their build sucks. In particular, other than Zevran and Ogren's specific cases, this is likely to be the case with an archer because archery in DAO is notoriously finicky. I highly recommend my Liliana guide or the archery section of my warrior or rogue guides. At the moment of posting this video, my rogue guide isn't yet available, but if you're watching this later, it might be. You may also not really like two-handed combat because it feels too slow, so that means you'd lose out on using Sten or Ogren since they mostly have points invested in the two-handed tree. Unfortunately, in the base game, there isn't a way to respecialize characters, so you're stuck with what you get. However, if you're playing on PC, then you can install a mod that allows you to respecialize your Warden and companions, and that way you can get rid of whatever type of build you don't like and be able to use a character you like in your party. I recommend the Respecification DAO mod by Dewin95. I've been using that one for years. It adds a few respecialization skills in your Warden skill screen, and you're able to partly or fully respec any character, including changing their class if you want to experiment even more with party compositions like having a full rogue or full mage party. I'll put the link to it in the description. These have been my warnings about companion builds. Sorry to console players, since there's not much they can do to make things easier or better for Oghren and Zevran, and of course because they don't have access to respecialization mods. But I hope that PC players at least will feel empowered to use mods if they find certain companions not fun to use in their party from a gameplay perspective. Now let's get into the detailed breakdown of the party compositions I recommend based on your Warden's class and build archetype. I'll start with party compositions for a Rogue Warden, since I think that is the most played class in Origins. As a Rogue, you will be a damager, either as a dual wielder or an archer. It is possible to play something that is akin to a support as a rogue if you pick the Bard and Ranger specializations as an archer, but even then your archer can still deal a lot of damage with their auto attacks and powerful activated auto crit abilities like Arrow of Slaying and Critical Shot. If your Warden is a dual wielding damager, you need two main things in your party: a tank and a ranged damager. The tank I generally recommend is either a weapon and shielder like Alistair, or a two-hander like Sten, or Shale with either the Stone Aura or Stoneheart tree. I personally use Stoneheart because I can't be bothered to keep repositioning Shale with Stone Aura. For the ranged damager, you can either use an archer like Leliana, or use a mage for ranged damage, and for that I'd recommend Morrigan since she'll already have some good damaging spells unlocked. Finally, for the last party member, I'd recommend another damager or a more support-oriented character. If you want a damager, I'd use a two-handed or dual-wielding damaging warrior, an archer, or a mage if you don't have one already. If you want a more support-oriented character, a support mage like Wynn focused on mostly healing and buffing your party is great, though you could also get a support-focused archer if you choose the Bard and Ranger specializations. If your Warden is a rogue archer, I will assume they're focused on damage and not on the uncommon support build. As an archer damager, you will need three things: a tank, a melee damager, and another ranged character who can be either support or damage. The tank is, just like before, essential to your party, and the same build recommendations apply. Since your Warden is doing damage from a range, it would be best for your second damager to be a melee one, either a dual-wielding rogue or warrior, or a two-handed warrior. You could also choose the tank damager hybrid, since archers do quite a lot of damage already, so having a second tanky character in the front line can be quite nice. An arcane warrior mage that's tanky would also work well here. I will warn you again though that I generally don't recommend you use a dual-wielding rogue unless you're fine with putting in the extra effort, either to manually position them for backstabs or ensure more frequent backstabs with coup de grace, paralyze runes, and other stunning or paralyzing abilities. Finally, for the last party member, I would personally use a mage that has both damage and healing. This can be either Morrigan or Wynn, whichever you prefer. The most important support spells are Heal, the group heal spell from the Spirit Healer specialization, and optionally some buff spells like Haste, Heroic Offense, Heroic Defense, and Heroic Aura. If you for some reason don't want to use a mage in your party, I'd recommend using a second archer who is more focused on support abilities like the Song of Courage or Song of Valor sustains from Bard, and the Bear or Wolf summons from the Ranger. When playing as a Rogue Warden, you don't have to worry about having another rogue in your party for the purpose of unlocking doors or chests or disarming traps, since you can easily ensure your Warden can take care of those. You're also a good damager, so that lets you focus on supporting your Warden with a tank and supports, possibly even omitting a second damager and focusing entirely on keeping your Warden protected while they deal most of the damage. My ideal party compositions for a Rogue Warden would be these: a dual-wielder Rogue Warden plus Alistair as a weapon and shield tank, plus Morrigan for damage and healing, plus Leliana as an archer for ranged damage as well as some support from her Bard specialization. An archer Rogue Warden, plus Shale as the main tank with Stoneheart, plus Alistair with the hybrid Berserker Reaver build, plus Wynn for mostly support spells. Moving on to party compositions for a Warrior Warden. As a warrior, you can be a melee tank or a melee damager. Even though I discussed archery in my in-depth guide to the warrior class, most people don't really play an archer warrior because it's not as good as the rogue. Because of that, I won't recommend party compositions for a warrior archer. But if you do want to play a warrior archer, just follow my recommendations for a rogue archer since they play exactly the same. For both tank and damager warriors, remember first and foremost that you will need a rogue in the party to unlock doors and chests and disarm traps. If you don't care about losing out on the extra XP and loot, as well as being forced to grit your teeth through dangerous traps, then that's fine. But unless you're doing it as a challenge of some sort, I really do recommend having a rogue in the party. If your warden is a tank, either as a two-hander or weapon and shielder, you already have one of the essentials taken care of. So your party needs two things, a melee damager and a ranged damager. For the final character, I'd ideally use another ranged character that provides damage, support, or both. For your ranged damagers, I recommend an archer like Liliana or a mage like Morrigan. Though if you're going for a mage, I always recommend unlocking at least the heal and force field spells which you could use to help your allies out. And for your second ranged character, you can either use the other character between Liliana and Morrigan you didn't pick in the first category, or choose Wynn for more support. If you think that your two ranged characters will do enough damage, then your second melee character could be another tank, a tank damager hybrid using the Berserker Reaver build, or a tanky arcane warrior mage. If you're planning on using two warrior tanks, I recommend only using one weapon and shielder and one two-hander, since otherwise they will be competing for gear, and you won't be able to equip both characters equally well. The arcane warrior would work nicely since they are protected by using heavier armor as well as having various defensive spells. Wynn would work best out of the two mage companions, since she already starts with some buffs and defensive spells when you recruit her, though it will take some time until you get to unlock the arcane warrior specialization for her at level 14, unless you are able to respecialize her. If your warden warrior is a melee damager, two-handed dual wielding, or possibly weapon and shield with a hybrid build, then your party will need the following things. A proper tank, unless your hybrid weapon and shielder is able to tank well enough, a ranged damager, and another ranged character, either damage or support. Generally speaking, unless you really know what you're doing with a hybrid build, I would say to stay on the safe side and have a full tank with you just in case. In terms of ranged damagers, you can have an archer and a mage, two mages, or if you like a challenge, use two archers, but don't say I didn't warn you about the difficulty of not using a mage. Warriors have more interesting build variety when it comes to damage than rogues, simply because they have more weapon styles available. That gives you more options for your warrior warden, as well as for their party. My ideal party compositions for a warrior warden would be these. A weapon and shield tank warden, plus Liliana as an archer damager with a bit of support from the bard specialization, plus Morrigan as a mostly damager mage with a bit of healing, plus Sten or Oghren as a two-handed damager. Zevran with dual daggers would also work here, but remember my warning about backstabs. A two-handed tank warden, plus Alistair as a weapon and shield hybrid warrior, or Wynn as an arcane warrior mage, plus Liliana as an archer damager with a bit of support, plus Morrigan for damage and healing. A dual-wielding damager warden, plus Shale or Sten as the tank, plus Liliana as a damager, but also because she's a rogue, plus Wynn for mostly support spells. Your dual-wielding warden and Liliana will do plenty of damage, so that's why I'd recommend a more support-oriented mage here. The reason I don't recommend Alistair as a tank here is because you will likely want to use good longswords on your dual-wielding warden, and that will leave less options for Alistair's main weapon. A two-handed damager warden, plus Alistair or Shale as the tank, plus Liliana for ranged damage and rogue abilities, plus Morrigan or Wynn for AoE and support. A similar thing applies here for the reason I don't recommend a two-handed tank, since your two-handed damager warden will use some of the best gear for two-handed characters, and that will leave less good options for Sten or Oghren. A weapon and shield hybrid warden, plus Sten or Shale as the tank, plus Liliana for ranged damage and rogue abilities, plus Morrigan for extra damage and healing. In the case of a hybrid build, you won't be doing as much damage as a full damager build, so that's why I'm recommending Morrigan specifically as your second ranged companion, since she already has more damaging abilities unlocked by default. Keep in mind that if you have a respecialization mod, you can turn Zevran into an archer, Morrigan into a more support style mage, or Wynn into a more damager style mage, Alistair into a dual wielding damager, and so on. So if you really like a particular companion and you want to use them, but your Warden is already filling the build that your companion has, or else your companion's build doesn't fit the rest of the party well enough, use a respecialization mod to change your companion's build to suit your needs. Of course, this is unfortunately only on PC, but I think it's pretty fun to experiment with builds on all the companions once you've played through the game a few times with their regular starting abilities. Finally, we reached a point of this guide where I have to put a huge caveat ahead of my recommendations. The party composition recommendations if your Warden is a mage. Up until here, I could quite easily give you some advice for warrior and rogue wardens because their builds are much simpler to categorize into weapon style plus damager for rogues and weapon style plus damager or tank for warriors. With mages, you have a lot more freedom to combine spells from all the different schools, so it's not really as simple as mostly damager or support mage. I did use these terms to refer to Morrigan and Wynn because those are the natural kind of build paths they have, but even then, Morrigan could be built from there on as more of a debilitator, someone who debuffs and disables enemies with various crowd control effects like sleep, stun, freeze, fear, and paralyze. Or you could focus on the AoE area of effect damaging spells, which will absolutely make a damager build that feels different from one mainly focused on powerful single target spells. Same thing with Wynn. She could be a support that focuses on healing and buffing allies, but she could also be the type of support that debuffs enemies or lays down glyphs that impede them. You can also successfully make a hybrid build between damage and support, which is what I generally recommend and do because I don't like being limited to only one set of abilities. Because of this, it's even more so up to you to decide what your personal mage build is good at and what it needs help with from other companions. I'll still give you recommendations, of course, but I have no way of knowing which spells exactly you're using in your damager or support build. If your Warden is a damager mage, then your party needs the following elements: a tank, a melee damager, or a tanky melee damager, and for your final party member, you can either have another ranged damager, though I think that would be a bit overkill, or a ranged support like a bard ranger, archer, or a support mage. Whether you want or need a second mage in the party is up to personal preference. I do like to have a second mage in the party if my Warden is a mage, but not always. Other times, for my second ranged character, I prefer having a damager archer who doesn't depend on activated abilities so much and can just use auto attacks to deal a lot of damage to enemies. If your Warden is a support mage, then your party needs the following elements: a tank, a melee damager, rogue or warrior, though here I'd avoid the hybrid tanky builds, and a ranged damager, either an archer or a mage. Since your Warden won't do much damage themselves, you need the damagers in your party to do their job well, so that's why I recommend avoiding hybrid builds for your melee damager. Your Warden can keep them healed and buffed up, and your tank can keep enemies from attacking them, so focus as much as you can on your companion's damage in this case. If your Warden is an arcane warrior, I will assume that you are using a tanky kind of build that has a lot of defensive sustained spells turned on. Still, even so, you will need a proper tank in the party, because while your arcane warrior can be incredibly tanky, and thus very hard to kill, that doesn't mean you can protect your squishier damager allies since you don't have any taunting abilities. A tank damager hybrid would work here as long as they have the taunt and threaten abilities. For the other two party members, I recommend having two ranged characters, either two damagers or a damager and a support. Since the arcane warrior is more about being in the front line, I will assume you're not using healing spells often, so I recommend having a mage who can cast heal and group heal, even if they are a damager otherwise. These are just guidelines based on very simplified assumptions about a mage warden's build, because otherwise would be here all day. No matter what, you need a tank. Everything else is far more flexible. If you need a melee damager, there's plenty of options between your warrior companions and a dual-wielding rogue. If you need a ranged character, archers and mages are both good for different things. Archers are great at single target damage, especially with their auto-crit abilities Critical Shot and Arrow of Slaying, whereas mages are far more useful for their disabling spells, AoE damage, and buffs and debuffs. Keep in mind that you will also need a rogue in your party to unlock doors and chests, and disarm traps, just like I mentioned earlier for warrior wardens. My ideal party compositions for a mage warden would be these: a damager mage warden plus Alistair, Sten, or Shale as a tank, including the hybrid tank build, plus Zevran as a dual-wielding damager or Oghren as a two-handed damager, depending on your tank's weapon style, plus finally a ranged damager or support out of Liliana, Morrigan, and Wynn. a support mage Warden plus Alistair or Shale as a tank, plus Oghren, Sten, or Zevran as a strong melee damager, no hybrid builds here, plus Liliana or Morrigan as a ranged damager. An Arcane Warrior Mage Warden plus Sten or Shale as a tank, plus a ranged damager out of Liliana and Morrigan, plus a second ranged character, either damage or support, out of Liliana, Morrigan, and Wynn. I'm not recommending Alistair as a tank here because your Arcane Warrior Mage will likely want to use some good weapon and shield gear that will leave Alistair with less options. As a little conclusion, you can see that other than having a tank, a melee damager, and a ranged damager, the overall party compositions can be quite different. You don't necessarily need to use a ranged support if you don't want to. You could just stock up on health poultices for healing and let your entire team focus on damage. I do think that you might end up in some difficult situations if you don't have any support abilities or spells in the party though, because there are certain types of enemies that are very dangerous, like ogres, dragons, werewolves, and in some cases spiders. If those enemies use an auto-hit ability like grab or overwhelm, the affected character won't be able to use a health poultice to heal themselves and might fall unconscious before the ability ends. You may sometimes be able to interrupt some of these abilities by knocking down or stunning the enemy, but it's not guaranteed that it will work. Sometimes these abilities are simply uninterruptible, so having a mage who can either heal the affected party member or cast force field on them to make them immune becomes extremely useful. You also have enemy spellcasters to worry about because they have dangerous spells like Curse of Mortality, which makes the affected character unable to heal, or Crushing Prison, which paralyzes the character while constantly damaging them and allowing them to be damaged by others. When it comes to enemy mages, you can mitigate these issues by having a Templar in your party who can cast Cleanse Area and remove the negative spell effect from an ally. But if your Templar is the one being paralyzed by Crushing Prison or an actual paralysis spell, then they won't be able to get themselves out of that situation. Of course, maybe you just get lucky and get some huge critical hits on these types of enemies and kill them before they do any of these things, in which case, having a mage doesn't feel so important. But it's pretty hard to have such powerful builds, especially in the early game, if you don't use exploits which ruin the game. Anyway, this has been my guide to party compositions in Dragon Age Origins. I hope this can help you choose your party in the game with more confidence, and make the combat more fun due to your characters all working well together. As always, if you're looking forward to more videos about RPGs and other games I like, do remember to subscribe, and leave a like and comment while you're at it too. They really help. This has been B-Tier Mutineer. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.